This is not being announced in headlines. It's not leading breaking news banners. There are no emergency press conferences. And yet, one of the most important shifts in global power is happening right now, quietly, deliberately, and with enormous consequences. Because as we speak, the world is preparing to move beyond the Strait of Hormuz. Yes, that Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which nearly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day. The artery of global energy, the pressure point of the modern economy, the place where a single disruption can send shockwaves through markets, governments, and entire nations. And now, countries are no longer just worried about it. They are actively building ways to replace it. Let me say that again, because this is where it begins to sink in. The world is quietly building new routes to bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Think about that for a second. For decades, this narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman has been one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. Wars have been fought over less. Fleets have been stationed there permanently. Entire military doctrines have been built around controlling or protecting this one corridor. And now, behind the scenes, something is changing. Pipelines are being extended across deserts. Ports are being expanded at record speed. Rail networks are being redesigned, not for convenience, but for survival. Energy corridors are being redrawn, not on maps you see on the news, but in closed-door meetings between global powers. Why? Because the world no longer trusts that the Strait of Hormuz will remain open, stable, or safe. And here is where things get serious. This is not just about oil. This is about power. This is about control. This is about what happens when the single most critical choke point in the global economy becomes too risky to depend on. Because ask yourself this: what happens if that route is blocked, even for a few days? Prices spike, markets panic, supply chains freeze, governments scramble, military tensions explode. We've seen glimpses of this before: small disruptions, brief confrontations, moments where the world held its breath. But now the calculation has changed. Countries are no longer asking, what if something happens? They are acting as if something will happen. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because what we are witnessing is not a reaction. It is a preparation, a long-term strategic shift away from one of the most dangerous dependencies in the global system. And the most striking part? Almost nobody is talking about it. No loud declarations, no global announcements, just quiet construction, silent agreements, strategic investments moving billions, sometimes trillions, of dollars into alternative routes that could reshape global trade forever. But here's the part nobody is talking about. If the world succeeds in bypassing the Strait of Hormuz, then the balance of power in the Middle East and beyond will never be the same again. Let that sink in, because this isn't just about avoiding risk. It's about rewriting the rules. Let me explain what this means, because once you see the full picture, you start to realize this is not a single project, not a single country, and definitely not a coincidence. This is a coordinated global shift. Right now, multiple nations, especially in the Middle East, are investing heavily in infrastructure designed to move oil and gas without ever touching the Strait of Hormuz. And the key players behind this are not small actors. We're talking about regional heavyweights like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and even rising strategic planners inside China. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. For years, Saudi Arabia has quietly expanded its east-west pipeline, an overland route that allows oil to be transported from the Persian Gulf to ports on the Red Sea. That means oil can completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz and still reach global markets. Think about that. Oil that once had to pass through one of the most vulnerable choke points on Earth can now be redirected across land and shipped out safely from the other side. And it doesn't stop there. The United Arab Emirates has done something very similar. It built a pipeline stretching from its inland oil fields directly to the port of Fujairah, outside the Strait of Hormuz. That means tankers can load up without ever entering the high-risk zone. No choke point, no bottleneck, no waiting. Now ask yourself, why would they spend billions of dollars building these alternatives if they believed the strait was secure? Exactly. But here is where things get even more interesting. China, yes, China is playing a long game here. Through its massive Belt and Road Initiative, it is investing in ports, railways, and energy corridors across Asia, the Middle East, and even into Europe. These routes are not just about trade efficiency, they are about risk diversification. Because China knows something critical. Its economy depends heavily on energy imports, much of which passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And that dependency? That's a vulnerability. So what is China doing? It is building options. pipelines through Pakistan, port access agreements in the Arabian Sea, infrastructure links that reduce reliance on traditional maritime choke points. And this is where the story takes a deeper turn. Because this isn't just about building new routes, it's about creating an entirely new energy map. Countries are no longer thinking in terms of fastest route or cheapest route. They are thinking in terms of safest route. Let that sink in. Safety has now become more valuable than efficiency. And when that happens, everything changes. But here's the part nobody is talking about. These projects are not being built overnight. Some of them have been in development for years, quietly moving forward while the world focused on short-term crises, political drama, and market fluctuations. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, a new system has been taking shape. A system designed to survive conflict. A system designed to operate even if the Strait of Hormuz becomes unusable. And here is where things get serious. Because once these alternative routes are fully operational, the Strait of Hormuz, once the ultimate leverage point, starts to lose its power. Think about that for a second. A choke point only matters if the world depends on it. Remove that dependency, and you remove the leverage. Wrong. This is about the slow dismantling of one of the most powerful geopolitical pressure points in modern history. The Strait of Hormuz has never just been a shipping lane. It has been leverage. It has been influence. It has been a silent weapon in the balance of global power. For decades, one country in particular has understood this better than anyone else: Iran. Because of its geographic position, Iran has always had the ability, at least in theory, to threaten or disrupt traffic through the strait. And that alone has given it a form of strategic influence that goes far beyond its economic size. Think about what that means. Without firing a single shot, without launching a single missile, Iran has held a card that could shake the global economy. Even the possibility of disruption has been enough to send oil prices surging. Let that sink in. That's power. But now, that power is slowly being eroded, because if oil can move around the strait instead of through it, then the threat of blocking it becomes far less effective. And this is where things get serious. We're not just talking about a regional shift, we're talking about a global economic transformation. Because energy is not just another commodity. Energy is the foundation of everything. Transportation, manufacturing, food production, digital infrastructure, everything depends on a stable flow of energy. And for decades, that flow has passed through a narrow, vulnerable corridor. Now imagine a world where that vulnerability is reduced. Oil prices become less reactive to regional tensions. Shipping routes become more flexible. Supply chains become more resilient. Sounds like a good thing, right? Yes. But here's the catch. When you remove one form of leverage, you create space for another. And this is the part nobody is talking about. If the Strait of Hormuz loses its central importance, then power doesn't disappear. It shifts. It moves to whoever controls the new routes. Think about that for a second. If pipelines across Saudi Arabia become critical, then control over those pipelines becomes strategic power. If ports in the UAE become major export hubs, then their security and their alliances become more important than ever. If overland routes backed by China expand across Asia, then China's influence over global trade doesn't just grow, it accelerates. So what are we really looking at here? A redistribution of global influence, a quiet reshuffling of who holds the keys to the world's energy supply. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because while some countries are gaining flexibility, others may be losing their strategic advantage. Iran, for example, may find that its most powerful bargaining chip is no longer as strong as it once was. And if that happens, what does it do next? Does it adapt? Does it escalate? Does it seek new ways to project influence? These are not theoretical questions. These are the kinds of decisions that shape conflicts, alliances, and global stability. And here is where things get even more intense. Because markets are already watching this. Investors, energy companies, and governments are quietly factoring in a future where the Strait of Hormuz is no longer the single point of failure it once was. That changes risk calculations, that changes pricing models, that changes long-term strategies, and when those things change, the entire system begins to shift, slowly at first, then all at once. Let that sink in. This is a calculated power move. A long-term, multi-layered strategy designed not just to reduce risk, but to reshape control. Let me explain what this means. For decades, global energy strategy was built around one assumption: protect the choke points, secure the sea lanes, keep the flow moving through places like the Strait of Hormuz at all costs. That's why massive naval fleets patrol the region. That's why alliances were formed. That's why military doctrines were written with one goal in mind: keep that corridor open. But now, the strategy is evolving. Instead of defending a single vulnerable route, countries are creating multiple alternatives. And this is where the real shift begins, because diversification is power. The more routes you have, the less anyone can control you. Think about that for a second. If your entire economy depends on one narrow passage, then whoever can threaten that passage has leverage over you. But if you have 5 different ways to move your energy, that leverage disappears. And this is exactly what countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are doing. They are not just building infrastructure, they are building independence. Pipelines that cross entire deserts, export terminals positioned outside high-risk zones, storage facilities that allow flexibility in timing and routing. These are not short-term projects. These are decades-long investments designed to future-proof their economies. But here is where things get even more strategic, because this isn't just about bypassing risk, it's about controlling the alternatives. If you build the pipeline, you control the flow. If you own the port, you control the access. If you secure the route, you influence the market. Let that sink in. This is about shifting from vulnerability to control. And then there's another layer to this, a global layer. Because while regional powers are building physical infrastructure, global powers are shaping the network around it. Take China, for example. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China is not just investing in roads and ports, it's embedding itself into the very structure of global trade routes. Railways connecting inland regions to coastal hubs, ports that serve as strategic gateways, energy corridors that link producers directly to consumers. And here is the key point. China doesn't need to control the Strait of Hormuz if it can help build the routes that replace it. Think about what that means. Influence without confrontation, power without direct conflict, a presence that grows quietly, steadily, and strategically. And this is where the story takes a deeper turn. Because while some countries are building alternatives, others are adapting their entire military and economic strategies around this shift. Naval dominance still matters, but now it's only part of the equation. Land routes matter more, infrastructure matters more, logistics networks matter more, and the countries that understand this early, they gain an advantage that is very difficult to reverse. But here's the part nobody is talking about. This transition doesn't happen without tension, because when you start changing the routes of global energy, you start changing the balance of power, and not everyone benefits equally. Some gain flexibility, some gain influence, and some? They lose leverage they've relied on for decades, and that's where things get unpredictable, because when power shifts, reactions follow, not always in headlines, but in signals. Subtle shifts in policy, sudden investments, quiet military repositioning, market behavior that doesn't quite match the official narrative. Let me explain what this means. Energy markets are extremely sensitive to risk. Even the hint of instability around the Strait of Hormuz has historically triggered price spikes across global oil markets. But something unusual has been happening. Despite ongoing tensions in the region, markets have not reacted with the same level of panic as they once did. Why? Because investors are starting to believe that the world is becoming less dependent on a single choke point. Think about that for a second. When fear loses its grip on the market, pricing changes, volatility decreases, risk premiums shrink, and entire financial models begin to adjust. Let that sink in. This is not just a physical shift, it's a psychological one. And here is where things get serious. Governments are also reacting. Some are doubling down on securing their own infrastructure. Others are forming new partnerships, energy deals, logistics agreements, security alliances, all designed to ensure access to these emerging alternative routes. Because no country wants to be left behind in a system that is being quietly rewritten. Meanwhile, inside Iran, this shift is impossible to ignore. For years, the strategic value of its geographic position has been one of its strongest assets. But if that value begins to decline, what happens next? Does Iran attempt to reassert its influence? Does it escalate tensions to remind the world that the strait still matters? Or does it pivot, seeking new strategies, new alliances, new leverage points? These are critical questions. Because history shows us something very clearly. When a nation feels its influence slipping, it doesn't simply accept it. It reacts. And those reactions can take many forms. Diplomatic pressure, strategic signaling, military posturing, sometimes even direct confrontation. And this is where the uncertainty begins to grow. Because while some countries are reducing their exposure to risk, others may feel that their window of influence is narrowing, and that creates pressure. Pressure to act, pressure to assert, pressure to change the narrative. But it's not just governments. Major energy companies are also shifting their strategies. They are investing in infrastructure that aligns with these new routes. They are diversifying supply chains. They are hedging against scenarios where traditional pathways become less reliable. And when corporations start moving billions of dollars in anticipation of change, you know the shift is real. Let that sink in. Even global shipping patterns are beginning to evolve. Ports that were once secondary are becoming primary hubs. Routes that were once considered alternatives are becoming central corridors. And all of this is happening gradually, almost invisibly, until suddenly, it isn't. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because while the transition may seem smooth on the surface, the underlying tensions are anything but. Competing interests, strategic rivalries, economic pressures, all building beneath the surface. And the more the system changes, the more those pressures intensify. Because every new route creates new dependencies. Every new dependency creates new vulnerabilities. And every vulnerability becomes a potential flashpoint. Think about what that means. We are not eliminating risk. We are redistributing it. This is not just about the Strait of Hormuz. This is about the end of an era. For decades, globalization was built on a simple idea: efficiency above all else. The fastest routes, the cheapest labor, the most streamlined supply chains, everything optimized, everything interconnected, everything dependent. And that system worked until it didn't. Because what we've learned over the past few years is something very uncomfortable. Efficiency creates vulnerability. Think about that for a second. When the entire world depends on a handful of critical routes, any disruption, whether it's conflict, political tension, or even a single unexpected event, can ripple across the entire global economy. We've seen it happen before. Supply chains freezing, shipping costs exploding, entire industries slowing down because one link in the chain broke. Now apply that same logic to energy, the most important resource in the global economy, flowing through one narrow corridor. It was never sustainable, and deep down, governments knew it. That's why what you're seeing now is part of a much larger shift, from efficiency to resilience. Let me say that again, from efficiency to resilience. Countries are no longer asking, what is the fastest way to move energy? They are asking, what is the safest way to guarantee it keeps moving, no matter what? And that changes everything, because resilience requires redundancy, multiple routes, multiple partners, multiple options, and that means the global system becomes more complex, but also more stable, at least in theory. But here is the part nobody is talking about. Resilience comes at a cost. Building pipelines across deserts isn't cheap. Expanding ports, securing routes, maintaining infrastructure, it requires massive investment. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars over time. So why are countries willing to pay that price? Because the cost of disruption is even higher. Think about that. A single major blockage in the Strait of Hormuz could send oil prices skyrocketing, $150, $200 per barrel or more. Economies could slow. Inflation could surge. Political instability could follow. Compared to that, infrastructure starts to look like an insurance policy. And this is where the story connects to something even bigger, a global reordering of power. Because as new routes emerge, new alliances begin to form. Countries that were once peripheral become central. Regions that were once overlooked become strategically critical. Take the growing importance of overland corridors connecting Asia to the Middle East, or ports along the Arabian Sea that are suddenly becoming key transit hubs. These are not random developments. They are part of a broader trend, one where geography is being redefined by infrastructure. Let that sink in. Geography used to be destiny. Now, infrastructure is rewriting geography. And this is where things get really interesting, because the countries that invest early in these new networks don't just gain security, they gain influence. They become indispensable. And in a world where energy is still the foundation of power, being indispensable is everything. But there's also a deeper layer to this, a strategic layer, because reducing dependence on the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just change economics, it changes military calculations. Naval dominance still matters, yes, but if less energy is flowing through vulnerable sea lanes, then the strategic importance of controlling those lanes begins to shift, and that forces major powers to rethink their entire approach. Where to deploy forces, how to protect interests, what conflicts matter most. Think about what that means. We are witnessing not just a change in trade routes, but a transformation in how power itself is projected. And that transformation, because this is where the future starts to take shape. and where the stakes become impossible to ignore. Let me explain what this means. We are now entering a phase where these alternative routes are no longer just backup plans. They are becoming primary systems, and once that transition crosses a certain threshold, there is no going back. Think about that for a second. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been the default artery of global energy. But what happens when it becomes just one option among many? Its strategic weight diminishes. Its ability to influence global markets weakens, and the countries that once relied on it begin to operate with a new level of confidence. That's scenario one, a gradual shift, no dramatic collapse, no sudden disruption, just a steady decline in importance as more oil and gas flows through alternative routes, pipelines, ports, and overland corridors that quietly take over the role the strait once dominated. And in that scenario, the world becomes more stable, at least on the surface. But here is where things get serious. There's also scenario two, a sudden shock. A geopolitical crisis, a military confrontation, or even a temporary closure that forces the world to test these alternative routes in real time. Now think about what that would look like. Oil tankers rerouting overnight, prices reacting instantly, governments activating contingency plans that have been years in the making. And here's the key question: would the system hold? If these new routes are strong enough, the shock gets absorbed. If they're not, the consequences could be massive. Let that sink in, because preparation only matters when it's tested. And then there's scenario three, the one nobody wants to talk about, but everyone is quietly preparing for. A world where competition over these new routes becomes the next major source of conflict, because once the Strait of Hormuz loses its dominance, attention shifts to pipelines, to ports, to corridors running through politically sensitive regions, and suddenly the question is no longer who controls the choke point. It becomes who controls the network. Think about that. Control over a single location is powerful, but control over an entire network? That's influence on a completely different level. And this is where global powers begin to position themselves. China expanding its infrastructure footprint, regional powers strengthening their export capabilities, new alliances forming around shared economic and security interests, all of it pointing toward a future where energy routes are no longer concentrated but distributed. And that changes how conflicts emerge. Instead of one critical flashpoint, you now have multiple potential pressure zones. Instead of one choke point, you have a network of strategic assets, each one a possible target, each one a possible bargaining chip. And this is where the uncertainty grows, because a distributed system is harder to disrupt completely, but it's also harder to protect entirely. Let that sink in. More resilience, but more complexity. More options, but more moving parts. And in a world like that, small events can escalate in unexpected ways. A disruption in one corridor could shift pressure to another. A conflict in one region could ripple across multiple supply chains. And the more interconnected these new routes become, the more unpredictable the system gets. But here is the part nobody is talking about. The transition itself may be the most dangerous phase, because we are moving from one system to another, from dependence to diversification, from a single choke point to a global network. And during that transition, old tensions don't disappear, and new ones aren't fully stabilized yet. It's a period of overlap, a period of adjustment, a period where miscalculations become more likely. And history has shown us something very clearly. Periods of transition are when the biggest shifts and the biggest conflicts tend to happen. Think about what that means. The world is not just building new routes. It is entering a new era. The Strait of Hormuz is not disappearing, but its dominance is. And that changes everything. For decades, the world operated under a silent understanding that this narrow stretch of water was too important to fail, too critical to lose, too dangerous to ignore. And because of that, entire strategies were built around it. Military presence, diplomatic pressure, economic planning, all orbiting around one choke point. But now, that center of gravity is shifting, quietly, gradually, but unmistakably. Let that sink in. Because what we are witnessing is not just a change in routes, it's a change in mindset. A world that once accepted vulnerability as a necessity is now actively engineering its way out of it. And that sounds like progress. It sounds like stability. It sounds like a smarter, safer system. But here's the question you have to ask yourself. Is it really? Because every time humanity solves one vulnerability, it creates another. Think about that for a second. We reduce dependence on one choke point, but we increase reliance on complex networks. We eliminate a single point of failure, but we introduce multiple points of tension. We gain flexibility, but we lose simplicity. And in that complexity, new risks begin to emerge. Risks that are harder to predict, harder to control, harder to contain. And this is where the real story lies. Not in the pipelines, not in the ports, not even in the politics, but in the transformation of the system itself. A system that is becoming more resilient, and at the same time more fragile in entirely new ways. Because when power is concentrated, it's dangerous. But when power is distributed, it becomes unpredictable. Let that sink in. And now think about the bigger implication. If the world no longer depends on a single choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, then the old rules no longer apply. Deterrence changes, leverage shifts, alliances evolve, and the balance of power begins to move, not in dramatic headlines, but in quiet, irreversible steps. So here's the final question. Are we witnessing the stabilization of the global system, or are we watching the early stages of a more complex, more fragmented, and potentially more volatile world? Because the answer to that question will define the next decade, and maybe the next era of global power itself.